Okay, it's May 4th, 2018, and I'm starting today with Five Chimneys by Olga Lengyel. I don't know how to say her name. Chapter 10, A New Reason for Living. Occasionally men came to our infirmary. These were usually internees employed in the women's camps as laborers. When they returned to their places in the evening, their infirmaries were closed. We could not refuse to treat them, although it was strictly verboten by the Germans. But their injuries had resulted from accidents at work. Among these ailing men was an elderly Frenchman, whom I shall call L. A bad wound on his foot made him a regular visitor to the infirmary. L was a charming person, and we welcomed him joyfully. Each time he brought comforting news on the military and political situation in Europe. While we nursed his hurts, he soothed our troubled spirits. L was almost the only source of world news we had. At least he gave factual information, not fantastic rumors. From the attitude of our jailers, it was impossible to draw any conclusions, for they seemed to regard the camp as a permanent institution. Seen from Auschwitz-Birkenau, the bloody war was far away and almost unreal. Indeed, we had no war experiences except infrequent air raid alarms. When the latter sounded, the brave SS fled from the camp at full speed to hide in the forests, pausing only to return us to our camps. They carefully locked all the gates. The inmates were exposed to the danger of the expected bombs, while the SS sought shelter. Because I was passing through a serious nervous depression, the news that L brought was a real booster to my morale. In material things, my situation had improved since I had started to work at the infirmary. Yet my life seemed a frightful burden. I had lost my parents and my children, and I had no word of my husband, the only person whose existence could keep me in the land of the living. I was mentally ripe for suicide. My companions saw that I was wasting away right before their eyes. One day L took me aside. "You have no right to throw away your life," he scolded. "If this existence has no more attraction for you personally, you must go on if only to try to relieve the sufferings of the others around you. Your position is perfect for rendering service in many ways." He gave me a penetrating glance. "Obviously," he continued, "this will not be without danger. But isn't danger our daily bread here? The essential thing is to have a goal, a purpose." It was my turn to look squarely into his eyes. "I place myself at your service," I returned. "What must I do?" "You can do two things for us," he replied. "First, you can spread carefully all the news that I give you. This is of the utmost importance to maintain the morale of the internees. Do you agree?" The dissemination of false news was forbidden by the Germans on pain of death. False news in quote marks. But what was death? I did not even think of it. "Second," he went on, "your job makes you ideal to serve as a post office. People will bring you letters and parcels. You will deliver them according to the instructions you are given. And not a word to anyone, not even to your best friends. For if you are ever caught, you will be questioned, and we do not want there to be any witnesses against you. Not everybody can stand torture. Do you think you would be strong enough to take their torture?" I was silent. Were there more sufferings one could undergo? I could try to be strong. He reflected, then added, "Still another thing. We must observe everything that goes on here. Later we shall write down all that we have seen. When the war is over, the world must know about this. It must know the truth." From that moment on, I had a new reason for living. I was a member of the resistance movement. After that interview, I had the opportunity to meet others in our underground. Quote marks again. We limited our relations to our work and did not seek to learn one another's names. Caution made this mandatory so that we could avoid betraying each other should we be arrested and tortured. Through these new contacts, I finally learned the minutest details about the gas chamber and the crematories. In the beginning, those who were condemned to death at Birkenau were either shot in the forests of Brzezinski or gassed at the infamous White House in the camp. The corpses were incinerated in a death pit. After 1941, 4 crematory ovens were put into service, and the output of this immense extermination plant was augmented vastly. Output in quote marks. At first, Jews and non-Jews were sent to the crematory equally, without favor. After June 1943, the gas chambers and the crematory ovens were reserved exclusively for Jews and Gypsies. Except for reprisal or by error, Aryans were not sent there. but generally Aryans were executed by shooting, hanging, or by poison injections. Of the 4 crematory units at Birkenau, 2 were huge and consumed enormous numbers of bodies. The other 2 were smaller. Each unit consisted of an oven, a vast hall, and a gas chamber. Above each rose a high chimney, which was usually fed by 9 fires. The 4 ovens of Birkenau were heated by a total of 30 fires. Each oven had large openings. That is, there were 120 openings, into each of which 3 corpses could be placed at one time. That meant they could dispose of 360 corpses per operation. That was only the beginning of the Nazi production schedule. 360 corpses every half hour, which was all the time it took to reduce human flesh to ashes, made 720 per hour, or 17,280 corpses per 24-hour shift. And the ovens, with murderous efficiency, functioned day and night. However, one must also reckon the death pits, which could destroy another 8,000 cadavers a day. In round numbers, about 24,000 corpses were handled each day. An admirable production record, one that speaks well for German industry. Even while in camp, I obtained very detailed statistics on the number of convoys which arrived at Auschwitz-Birkenau in 1942 and 1943. Today, the Allies know the exact number of such arrivals, for these figures were attested to many times in the course of the war criminals' trials. I shall cite only a few examples. In February 1943, 2 or 3 trains arrived at Birkenau every day. Each was 30 to 50 cars long. These transports included a large proportion of Jews, but also numbers of other enemies of the Nazi regime, political prisoners of all nationalities, ordinary criminals, and a considerable number of Russian prisoners of war. However, the supreme speciality of Auschwitz-Birkenau was the extermination of the Jews of Europe, the undesirable element par excellence, according to Nazi doctrine. Hundreds of thousands of Israelites were burned in the crematory ovens. Sometimes the ovens were so overtaxed that they could not do all the work even on the 24-hour-a-day shift. The Germans then had to burn the corpses in the death pits. Quote marks. These were trenches about 60 yards long and about 4 yards wide. They were provided with a cunning system of ditches to drain off the human fat. There was also a time when the trains came in even greater numbers. In 1943, 47,000 Greek Jews were brought to Birkenau. 39,000 were executed immediately. The others were interned, but they died like flies, unable to adapt themselves to the climate. Indeed, the Greeks and the Italians, probably because they were most poorly nourished before they came, bore up the poorest under the cold and the privations. In 1944 came the turn of the Hungarian Jews, and more than 500,000 of them were exterminated. I have the figures only for the months of May, June, and July 1944. Dr. Pasca, a French doctor of the Sonderkommando in the crematory, who was in a position to gather statistics on the rate of the extermination, provided me with these. May 1944, 360,000. June 1944, 512,000. From the 1st to the 26th of July 1944, 442,000, equaling 1,314,000. In that less than a quarter of a year, the Germans had liquidated more than 1,300,000 persons at Auschwitz-Birkenau. Okay, I was checking how long the chapter is. I'll finish this chapter. I had ample opportunity to witness the arrival of new trainloads of deportees. One day, in the company of 3 other internees, I was sent out for blankets for the infirmary. When we reached the station, a transport had just steamed in. The cattle cars were being emptied of the bruised and starved human beings who had been traveled together, about 100 packed together into each car. From this vast, miserable assembly, piteous cries rose in every language of Europe, in French, Romanian, Polish, Czech, Dutch, Greek, Spanish, Italian, who knows how many more. Water, water, something to drink. When I had arrived myself, I had seen everything in an incredulous fog, and I had been unable to make out details. One could hardly believe what one saw. But now I had learned to interpret everything. I recognized certain SS chiefs. I identified the infamous Kramer, whom the newspapers were to call the Beast of Belsen, and whose powerful silhouette dominated the scene. His cold mask, under his bristling hair, surveyed the deportees with a hard, piercing expression. Gazing at him, I was fascinated, as one looking at a cobra. Never shall I forget the thin smile of satisfaction that curved on his lips at the sight of this mass of humanity, so completely reduced to dependence upon his mercy. While the deportees were being disembarked, the camp orchestra, composed of inmates in striped pajamas, played swing tunes to welcome the new arrivals. The gas chamber waited, but the victims must be soothed first. Indeed, the selections at the station were usually made to the tune of languorous tangos, jazz numbers, and popular ballads. To one side, the ambulance trucks waited for the sick and aged. I have already described the first selection. The old, the sick, and children under 12 or 14 were sent to the left, the rest to the right. To the left meant the gas chamber and the crematory of Birkenau. To the right meant temporary reprieve in Auschwitz. Everything had to be correct at this lugubrious ceremony. Even the SS troops scrupulously observed the rules of the game. They had an interest in avoiding incidents. By such tactics, a few guards could maintain order among these thousands of condemned. Distressing episodes resulted from the separations, but the Nazis showed that they were not petty. When a young woman insisted that she would not be separated from her old mother, they often gave in and let the deportee rejoin the person she did not want to leave. Together they went to the left, to quick death. Then always to the sound of music. I could not help but think of the Pied Piper of the legend. The two cortèges began their procession. In the meantime, the service internees had assembled the baggage. Water break. The deportees still believed they would get their possessions when they arrived at their destinations. Other internees placed the sick into the Red Cross ambulances. They handled them tenderly until the marching columns were out of sight. Then the behavior of these SS slaves changed so completely. Brutally, they threw the sick into the dumping trucks, as if they were sacks of potatoes, for the ambulances were now filled. As soon as everybody was pushed in, with the prisoners groaning and shouting out of sheer terror, the cargo was sent off to the crematory ovens. Thanks to the direct evidence which I gathered through Dr. Pasha and the others in the underground, I can reconstruct the last living hours of those who were sent to the left. To the captivating tunes played by the internee musicians, whose own eyes misted with tears, the cortège of the condemned wound toward Birkenau. Fortunately, they were unconscious of the fate that awaited them. They saw a group of Hey, there's a wasp. Why is there a wasp in here? Okay. They saw a group of red brick buildings agreeably laid out and assumed it was a hospital. The SS troops escorting them were irreproachably correct. They were hardly that polite dealing with selectionees from the camp, whom it was not necessary to treat with kid gloves. But the newly arrived had to be handled properly to the very end. The condemned were led into a long underground viaduct called Local B, the letter B, which resembled the hall of a bath establishment. Up to 2,000 persons could be accommodated. The bath director, in a white blouse, distributed towels and soap, one more detail in the immense show. The prisoners then removed their clothes and disposed of their valuables on a huge table. Under the clothes hangers were plaques declaring in every European language, if you want your effects when you go out, please make note of the number of your hanger. The bath for which the condemned were being prepared was nothing but the gas chamber, which was right off the hall. This room was equipped with many showers, the sight of which had a reassuring effect upon the deportees. But the apparatus did not function, and no water came to the faucets. Once the condemned had filled the long, narrow gas chamber, the Germans ceased to play. The mask was down. Precautions were no longer necessary. The victims could not escape nor offer the least resistance. Sometimes the condemned, as though warned by some sixth sense, recoiled at the threshold. The Germans pushed them in brutally, not hesitating to fire their pistols into the mass. As many as possible were crowded into the room. When one or two children were left out, they were thrown on top of the heads of the adults. Then the heavy door shut like the slab of a crypt. Horrible scenes took place within the gas chamber, although it is doubtful if the poor souls suspected even then. The Germans did not turn on the gas immediately. They waited. For the gas experts had found it was necessary to let the temperature of the room mount by a few degrees. The animal heat given off by the human herd would facilitate the action of the gas. As the heat increased, the air fouled. Many of the condemned were said to have died before the gas was turned on. On the ceiling of the chamber was a square opening, latticed and covered with glass. When the time came, an SS guard in a gas mask opened the peephole and released a cylinder of Cyclone B, a gas with a base of hydrate of cyanide which was made at Dessau. Cyclone B was said to have a devastating effect, yet this did not always happen, probably because there were so many men and women to kill that the Germans economized. Oh, okay, they didn't always use Cyclone B. Besides, some of the condemned may have had high resistances. In any case, there were frequently survivors, but the Germans had no mercy. Still breathing, the dying victims were taken to the crematory and shoved into the ovens. According to the evidence of former internees at Birkenau, many eminent Nazi personalities, political men and others, were present when the crematory and the gas chambers were inaugurated. They were reported to have expressed their admiration for the functional capacity of the enormous extermination plant. On the inauguration day, 12,000 Polish Jews were put to death, a minor sacrifice to the Nazi Moloch. Okay, about 2 pages left. The Germans did let a few thousand deportees at a time live, but only to facilitate the extermination of millions of others. They made these victims perform their dirty work. They were part of the Sonderkommando. 300 or 400 serviced each crematory oven. Their duties consisted of pushing the condemned into the gas chambers and, after the mass murder was accomplished, of opening the doors and hauling out the corpses. Doctors and dentists were preferred for certain tasks, the latter to salvage the precious metal in the false teeth of the cadavers. The members of the Sonderkommando also had to cut the hair of the victims, a reclamation that provided additional revenue for the National Socialist economy. Dr. Pasha, who was himself impressed into the Sonderkommando, provided me with the daily routine of the crematory personnel. For, paradoxical as it may seem, and this was not the only paradox in the camps, the Germans furnished a special doctor to care for the slaves in the extermination plant. Dr. Pasha was active in the resistance movement and at the risk of his life kept day-to-day statistics. He communicated his data only to a few of whom he was absolutely certain, in the hope that one day these figures would be brought before the world. Dr. Pasha had no illusions about what awaited him. Indeed, he was liquidated long before the liberation of Auschwitz. From the eyewitness reports, one can gather what the spectacle in the gas chamber was after the doors were opened. In their hideous suffering, the condemned had tried to crawl on top of one another. During their agonies, some had dug their fingernails into the flesh of their neighbors. As a rule, the corpses were so compressed and entangled that it was impossible to separate them. The German technicians invented special hook-tipped poles which were thrust deep into the flesh of the corpses to pull them out. Wasp is over there now. Once extracted from the gas chamber, the cadavers were transported to the crematory. I have already mentioned that it was not unusual for a few victims should still be alive, but they were treated as dead and were burned with the dead. A hoist lifted the bodies into the ovens. The corpses were sorted methodically. The babies went in first as kindling, then came the bodies of the emaciated, and finally the larger bodies. Meanwhile, the reclamation service functioned relentlessly. The dentists pulled gold and silver teeth, bridges, crowns, and plates. Other officials of the Sonderkommando gathered rings, for, despite every control, some internees had kept theirs. Naturally, the Germans did not want to lose anything valuable. The Nordic supermen knew how to profit from everything. Immense casks were used to gather the human grease which had melted down at high temperatures. It was not surprising that the camp soap had such a peculiar odor, nor was it as Nor was it astonishing that the internees became suspicious at the sight of certain pieces of fat sausage. Even the ashes of the corpses were utilized, as fertilizer on the farms and gardens in the surrounding areas. The surplus was carted to the Vistula. The waters of this river carried off the remains of thousands of unfortunate deportees. The work of the Sonderkommando was indeed the hardest and most loathsome. 2 shifts worked 12 hours in relays. This staff had special quarters in the camp, and contact with the other inmates was strictly forbidden. Sometimes, as punishment, they were not even permitted to go back to the camp, but had to live in the building which housed the crematories. There they had enough heat, but what a ghastly place in which to eat and sleep. The life of the members of the Sonderkommando was truly infernal. Many among them went insane. Often a husband was forced to burn his wife, a father his children, a son his parents, a brother his sister. At the end of 3 or 4 months in such an inferno, the workers of the Sonderkommando were ready for their turn. The Germans had included that in the schedule. The men were gassed and then burned by those who had been brought up to take their places. The extermination plant could not let up in production, even while it changed personnel. I had then 2 reasons to live. 1, to work with the resistance movement and help as long as I could stand upon my feet. 2, to dream and pray for the day to come when I could go free and tell the world, this is what I saw with my own eyes. It must never be allowed to happen again. And that's the end of that chapter. Okay. Let me check my time. Okay, 21 minutes. I have 4 other things I might read. Not sure how well these go together. Well, let's lighten things up with some Edgar Allan Poe. Which might be the only time someone's ever said that. Okay, we're going to do a poem. That's the book I have here, is Poe Poems. Okay. Annabel Lee. It was many and many a year ago, in a kingdom by the sea, that a maiden there lived whom you may know by the name of Annabel Lee. And this maiden she lived with no other thought than to love and be loved by me. I was a child and she was a child in this kingdom by the sea, but we loved with a love that was more than love, I and my Annabel Lee. With a love that the winged seraphs of heaven coveted her and me. And this was the reason that, long ago, in this kingdom by the sea, a wind blew out of the cloud, chilling my beautiful Annabel Lee, so that her high-born kinsman came and bore her away from me, to shut her up in a sepulchre in this kingdom by the sea. The angels, not half so happy in heaven, went envying her and me. Yes, that was the reason, as all men know, in this kingdom by the sea, that the wind came out of the cloud by night, chilling and killing my Annabel Lee. But our love, it was stronger by far than the love of those who were older than we, of many far wiser than we, and neither the angels in heaven above, nor the demons down under the sea, can ever dissever my soul from the soul of the beautiful Annabel Lee. For the moon never beams without bringing me dreams of the beautiful Annabel Lee, and the stars never rise but I feel the bright eyes of the beautiful Annabel Lee. And so all the night tide I lie down by the side of my darling, my life and my bride, in the sepulchre there by the sea, in her tomb by the sounding sea. That was Annabel Lee by Edgar Allan Poe. Next, back to huge freaking disasters of the world. This is The Great Mortality, an intimate history of the Black Death, the most devastating plague of all time, written by John Kelly. Now, this is a library book, so if I get into it, I might have to buy my own copy, so that it doesn't have to go back before I'm finished. Let me figure out if I need to read the introduction here. The introduction's kind of nice and short. Maybe I should just read that instead of this first chapter. How long is this first chapter? Let me check the table of contents here. 29 pages. Yeah, let's go with the introduction. I could just read part of the chapter too, but I'll read the introduction here. Okay, so this is The Great Mortality by John Kelly, introduction. This book began as an inquiry into the future and ended as an investigation of the past. 5 years ago, when I first began thinking about writing a book on the plague, I had in mind plague in the generic sense of a major outbreak of epidemic disease, and I was looking ahead to the 21st century, not backward toward the 14th. From an earlier book on experimental medicine, Three on the Edge, the story of ordinary families in search of a medical miracle, I had gotten a glimpse of the power of unfettered pandemic disease. One of the people I wrote about was an AIDS patient. During the 2 years I followed him in the early 1990s, a time when effective HIV treatments were rare, the man lost a former lover, 3 friends, and a colleague at work. A hallmark of pandemic disease is its ability to destroy worlds, not just individuals. But it was one thing to know that, quite another to witness it. In 1995, the year I finished the book, Jonathan Mann, a professor at the Harvard University School of Public Health, warned that AIDS was the beginning of a frightful new era. The history of our time will be marked by recurrent eruptions of newly discovered diseases, he predicted. 2 years later, 1997, the New England Journal of Medicine issued a similar warning when a virulent new strain of bubonic plague was identified. The finding of multi-drug resistant strain of plague reinforces the concern that the threat from emerging infectious diseases is not to be taken lightly, declared the journal. Excuse me. Hiccuped. It's not to be taken lightly, declared the journal. Scarcely 20 years after the eradication of smallpox in 1979, an accomplishment widely described in the media as humanity's ultimate triumph over infectious disease, we seem to be slipping back into the world of our ancestors, a world of sudden, swift, and uncontrollable outbreaks of epidemic illness. The book I was thinking about would explore the nature of this threat, and in particular the danger posed by newly emerging illnesses such as Ebola fever, Marburg disease, hantavirus, pulmonary syndrome, SARS, and avian flu. The book I ended up writing is quite different, though indirectly it rehearses many of the same themes. Its subject is an outbreak of a particular infectious disease in a particular time and place. 700 years after the fact, what we call the Black Death, and what medieval Europeans called the Great Mortality, and medieval Muslims the Year of Annihilation, remains the greatest natural disaster in human history. Apocalyptic in scale, the Black Death affected every part of Eurasia, from the bustling ports along the China Sea to the sleepy fishing villages of coastal Portugal, and it produced suffering and death on a scale that, even after 2 world wars and 27 million AIDS deaths worldwide, remains astonishing. In Europe, where the most complete figures are available, in many places the plague claimed a third of the population. In others, half the population, and in a few regions, 60%. The affliction was not limited to humans. For a brief moment in the middle of the 14th century, the words of Genesis 7, "All flesh died that moved upon the earth," seemed about to be realized. There are accounts of dogs, cats, birds, camels, even of lions being afflicted by the boil, the telltale bubo of bubonic plague. Bubo? I didn't realize that was what that meant, bubonic. Huh. Interesting. By the time the pestilence ended, vast stretches of the inhabited world had fallen silent, except for the sound of the wind rustling through empty, overgrown fields. What led me from the book I planned to the book I wrote was an encounter with the literature of the Black Death. Before plunging into a book about the future of epidemic disease, I wanted to acquaint myself with its past, and the medieval plague, as the most famous example of the phenomenon, seemed the most appropriate place to start. Thus, in the autumn of 2000, I began shuttling between the main reading room of the New York Public Library and Butler Library at Columbia University. I read a number of excellent academic histories, but it was the original source material, the literature of the great mortality, the chronicles, letters, and reminiscences written by contemporaries, that turned my gaze from the future to the past. I had approached this material with some trepidation. If, as an English writer once observed, the past is a foreign country, no part of the past seems more foreign, more otherly, to a modern sensibility than the Middle Ages. My wariness proved unwarranted. Much has changed since the 1340s, the decade the Black Plague arrived in Europe, but not human nature. The Plague generation wrote about their experiences with a directness and urgency that, 700 years after the fact, retains the power to move, astonish, and haunt. After watching packs of wild dogs paw at the newly dug graves of the plague dead, a part-time tax collector in Siena wrote, "This is the end of the world." His contemporaries provided vivid descriptions of what the end of the world looked like, circa 1348 and 1349. It was corpses packed like lasagna in municipal plague pits, collection carts winding through early morning streets to pick up the previous day's dead, husbands abandoning dying wives and parents abandoning dying children for fear of contagion, and knots of people crouched over latrines and sewers, inhaling the noxious fumes in hopes of inoculating themselves against the plague. It was dusty roads packed with panicked refugees, ghost ships crewed by corpses, and a feral child running wild in a deserted mountain village. For a moment in the middle of the 14th century, millions of people across Eurasia began to contemplate the end of civilization, and with it, perhaps, the end of the human race. The medieval plague was one of the seminal events of the past millennium. It cast a deep shadow across the centuries that followed, and it remains part of the collective memory of the West. In discussions of AIDS and other emerging infectious diseases, the Black Death is constantly evoked as a warning from the past, something humanity must avoid at all costs. Yet as a historical event, the medieval plague remains little known. It originated in Inner Asia, somewhere in the still remote region between Mongolia and Kyrgyzia, and might well have remained there, had not the Mongols unified much of Eurasia in the 13th century, thereby facilitating the growth of three activities that continue to play an important role in the spread of infectious disease: trade, travel, and larger and more efficient communications. In the Mongols' case, the improvement in communication was the yam, the Tartar version of the Pony Express. From Inner Asia, one prong of the plague swept eastward into China, another westward across the steppe into Russia. Steppe? I don't know how to pronounce that. Into Russia. Sometime in the mid-1340s, the western wing reached Italian trading outposts in Crimea. From there, fleeting sailors carried the disease to Europe and the Middle East. Despite the enormous size of Eurasia and the slowness of medieval travel, in 1345 it took 8 to 12 months to travel from the Crimea to China overland. The plague spread to almost every corner of the continent within a matter of decades. It seemed to have erupted in Inner Asia sometime in the first quarter of the 14th century, and by the autumn of 1347 it was in Europe. In late September, Sicily was infected by a fleet of Genoese galleys. One chronicler reported that the Genoese tumbled off the infected ships with sickness clinging to their very bones. From Sicily, the pestilence moved swiftly northward to continental Europe. By March of 1348, much of central and northern Italy was, or soon would be, infected, including Genoa, Florence, and Venice, where gondolas slipped through wintry canals to collect the dead. By spring, the plague was in Spain, southern France, and the Balkans, where one contemporary reports that packs of wolves came down from the hills to attack the living and feed on the dead. By summer, the disease had reached northern France, England, and Ireland, where it took a great toll among the English and port towns like Dublin, but left the native Irish in the hills relatively unscathed. By the late autumn of 1348, the plague was in Austria and menacing Germany, and by 1349 and 1350 it had infected the regions along the European periphery: Scotland, Scandinavia, Poland, and Portugal. In a century when nothing moved faster than the fastest horse, the Black Death had circumnavigated Europe in a little less than 4 years. To many Europeans, the pestilence seemed to be the punishment of a wrathful creator. In September 1349, as the disease raced toward an anxious London, the English king Edward III declared that a just God now visits the sons of men and lashes the world. To many others, the only credible explanation for death on so vast a scale was human malfeasance. Evildoers were using poisons to spread the plague, warned Alfonso of Cordova. To many of Alfonso's contemporaries, that could only mean one thing. The Great Mortality occasioned the most violent outburst of anti-Semitism in the Middle Ages, a period already marked by violent anti-Semitic outbursts. Few events in history have evoked such extremes of human behavior as the medieval plague. There was the horrendous brutality of the flagellants, who trampled the roads of Europe, flailing their half-naked bodies and murdering Jews, and the sweet selflessness of the Sisters of Hotel U, who sacrificed their own lives to care for the plague victims of Paris. There was the fearfulness of Pope Clement VI, who fled Avignon, seat of the medieval church, a few months after the pestilence arrived, and the fearlessness of his chief physician, Guy de Chauliac. I'm awful. French is my absolute worst. Guy de Chauliac, who stayed in the afflicted city until the bitter end, so as to avoid infamy. The Great Mortality produced many examples of great cunning and compassion, charity and greed, and, in a testimonial to the stubbornness, some would say the irredeemable wickedness of human character, it also provided a backdrop for both the most notorious royal murder trial and greatest comic opera of the Middle Ages, the former featuring, as defendant, the beautiful Queen Joanna of Naples, the later, the Roman tribune Cola de Rienzo, possibly the silliest man in Europe. Throughout the worst months of the plague, somewhere in Europe men were always waging war on one another. The Great Mortality attempts to bring alive the world described in the letters, chronicles, and reminiscences of contemporaries. It is a narrative of a supreme moment in human history told through the voices, personalities, and experiences of the men and women who lived through it. However, since it is impossible to understand the pestilence without understanding its historical context, it is also a book about a time as well as an event. As the British historian Bruce Campbell has observed, the decades preceding the plague were exceptionally hazardous and unhealthy for both humans and domesticated animals. Almost everywhere in Europe there was war, overpopulation relative to resources, economic stagnation and decline, filth, overcrowding, epidemic, non-plague disease, and famine, as well as climatic and ecological instability. In retrospect, contemporaries interpreted the reign of woe as a portent of the coming apocalypse, and in a sense it was. The economic and social conditions of the early 14th century and the environmental instability of the period made Europe an unhealthy place to live. The Great Mortality also looks at new theories about the nature of the medieval plague. For well over a century it has been considered settled fact that the pestilence was a catastrophic outbreak of bubonic plague and a variant called pneumonic plague, which attacks the lungs. However, since in modern settings neither form of plague looks or acts much like the illness described in the Black Death literature, a number of historians and scientists have recently begun to argue that the mortality was caused by a different infectious illness, perhaps anthrax, perhaps an Ebola-like ailment. While history may never repeat itself, man, as Voltaire once observed, always does. The factors that allowed the Black Death to escape the remoteness of Inner Asia and to savage the cities of medieval Europe, China, and the Middle East still operate. Except, of course, today they operate on a vastly larger scale. Trade and human expansion, the twin anthems of modern globalization, have opened up ever more remote areas of the globe, while transportation has enhanced the mobility of both men and microbes incalculably. Wow, I'm not going to get it. Incalculably. A journey that took the plague bacillus decades to complete in the 14th century today takes barely a day. And for all the triumphs of modern science, infectious disease retains the ability to render us as impotent as our medieval ancestors. In the spring of 2001, English journalist Felicity Spector was reminded of that fact when an epidemic of hoof and mouth disease spun out of control, and the British government, hopeless to contain the outbreak, was forced to resort to methods that made Britain seem suddenly, shockingly medieval. We thought, wrote Spector in the New York Times, that modern medicine had brought us beyond the days when the only solution to an infectious disease was to burn entire herds of livestock, to close vast swaths of countryside, to soak rags and spread them on the roads. Modernity, it seems, is a very fragile thing. And that is the end of the introduction to The Great Mortality by John Kelly. I'm glad I read that. That wasn't just a fluffy introduction. That had stuff in it, so I'm glad I didn't just skip it. I kind of skimmed it to see if I should read it or not. Yeah. Okay, that's kind of a big book. I might have to buy my own copy, because this seems pretty interesting. Okay. Well, I picked some depressing books to read. I guess I'll stop there. The next time I'm going to try to read a different kind of stuff. Although I want to finish both of those books, so I might just read them more too. I don't know. I'll see what happens. But thanks for watching.